"Get out of my kitchen." The words hit the air like a hand coming down on a counter. The boy didn't move right away. He was 12 years old, standing at a stainless steel prep station with a tasting spoon in his hand and his eyes still on the pan. Because whatever was happening in that pan had been happening in a specific way, and he had been watching it with the focused attention of someone who genuinely could not look away. "Did you hear me?" I said, "Get out." Chef Raymond Calvert crossed the kitchen in 6 steps and took the spoon out of the boy's hand, not gently. He held it up like evidence, like the spoon itself was the offense. He was a large man with the particular authority of someone who had run professional kitchens for 20 years and had come to mistake volume for leadership and the ability to make people uncomfortable for the ability to make people better. He said, "This is a professional kitchen, not a petting zoo, not a field trip. You don't touch the equipment, you don't touch the food, and you certainly don't taste out of a pan that's going to table in 20 minutes. Who let you back here?" The boy said. The sauce was breaking. Calvert stared at him. "It was breaking," the boy said again, with the calm specificity of someone reporting a fact. "The heat was too high and the fat was separating. I fixed it. You can check. Nobody in that kitchen moved. 4 line cooks at their stations, a sous chef near the pass, a prep cook halfway through a case of shallots, every one of them still. The expediter had a ticket in his hand that he had stopped reading. Calvert looked at the pan. He looked at it for 2 seconds. Then he looked at the boy and said, "Get out of my kitchen before I call security." The boy put nothing on his face. He set his hands at his sides, and he walked toward the door without hurrying, with the specific dignity of someone who has learned that the only thing fully yours in a hostile room is the way you carry yourself through it. In his jacket pocket as he walked was a small notebook. Spiral-bound, black cover, its pages were dense with handwriting, recipes, ratios, observations, questions, the accumulated record of a mind that had been doing this since it was 8 years old. On the outside cover, in careful block letters, was a name. Nobody in that kitchen knew that notebook. Nobody in that kitchen knew what was in it. Nobody knew that 3 weeks from that afternoon, the notebook would be in someone else's hands, and the someone else would be on the phone within the hour. Have you ever been thrown out of a room that was made for exactly what you do? Have you ever had someone look at what you know and decide before you finish the sentence that you couldn't possibly know it? Let me take you back. Let me take you back past the kitchen, past the notebook, past the moment everything shifted. Let me take you back to where this began, which was a small apartment kitchen in New Orleans on a Saturday morning with the smell of something extraordinary coming from a pan. His name was Marcus Elias Toureau, not Mark. Marcus, because his grandmother had named him after a man she admired, and she was a woman who was precise about names because she understood that a name was the first thing the world knew about you before you had a chance to tell it anything else. He had grown up in the Treme neighborhood of New Orleans, in an apartment on St. Bernard Avenue above a barber shop owned by a man named Celestin, who played brass records on a turntable on Saturday mornings and whose music moved up through the floorboards and into the apartment like a second climate. The apartment had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that was barely large enough to contain the ambitions it regularly witnessed. Marcus shared the smaller bedroom with his younger sister, Adeyeze, who was 8 to his 12 in the year of the kitchen incident, and who had the personality of someone who had been born entirely complete and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. His mother was named Denise. She was an emergency room nurse at University Medical Center, which meant that her schedule was a revolving geography of day shifts and night shifts, and 12-hour stretches, and the occasional 36 hours that nobody talked up directly because talking about it made it feel like what it was, which was too much sustained over too long by someone who kept doing it anyway because the alternative was the ER without her, and she had done this work long enough to understand what that meant for the people who came through those doors. She was, in the margins of all of that, an exceptional cook, not professionally, domestically, in the specific tradition of a woman who had learned at the knee of a grandmother, who had learned at the knee of a grandmother, in a culinary inheritance that ran back through Louisiana and before that through the coastal regions of West. Africa, and forward again through the specific alchemy of New Orleans, which is a city whose food is a history, and whose history is a food, inextricable, layered, complex, in the way that only things built over centuries with the contributions of many hands can be complex. Denise cooked when she was home. When she was tired, she cooked simple things with depth. When she was rested, which was rare, she cooked the long things. The dishes that required 3 hours and attention, and a willingness to stay in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, when other options existed. Marcus had been watching her cook since before he could stand at the counter. He had been standing at the counter since he was 4, on a step stool that his grandfather had made from 2 pieces of lumber and a piece of carpet, watching his mother's hands. He had tasted from spoons since he could hold a spoon. He had asked questions with the relentless specificity of a child who is not asking to be annoying, but because the answers genuinely matter to him. Why do you add the water now and not before? What happens if you leave it longer? Why does the color change when you do that? Denise had answered every question. Not always completely. She didn't always know the chemistry, and she was honest about that, but always seriously. She had a principle about her children's questions. They were never stupid, and dismissing them was never cheaper than answering them. She had learned this from her own mother, who had learned it from hers. It was part of the inheritance, too. His grandmother, his mother's mother, a woman named Madeleine Thureau, who had been born in Tremy and would die in Tremy and in between, had made, by the conservative estimate of everyone who had ever eaten her food, the finest gumbo in a city that took its gumbo with deadly seriousness. Madeleine was the one who had given Marcus the notebook. He was 8 years old. She had handed it to him on a Sunday afternoon in her kitchen, which was 11 square feet of absolute authority. She had said, "You're going to want to remember things. Write them down." She had handed him a pen. She had gone back to the stove. He had written down what she did that afternoon. Every step, every decision. The moment she switched from a wooden spoon to a silicone spatula, and why. The order in which she added the aromatics, and why. The way she listened to the roux rather than watching it. The sound of it, she told him, told you more than the color if you knew how to listen. He had been writing in that notebook ever since. By the time he was 12, it was his 3rd notebook. The first 2 were on the shelf in his bedroom, filled. He had written recipes from his mother and his grandmother, and from the cookbooks he checked out from the public library branch on St. Claude, and from the cooking shows he watched with a specificity of attention that was qualitatively different from how other people watched television, because he was not watching for entertainment. He was watching as a student watches a lesson, extracting the principle beneath the technique. He had also by 12 developed a reputation in a 3-block radius of St. Bernard Avenue as someone who could cook. Not child cooking, not cooking for a 12-year-old cooking. Cooking. Celestin the barber had tasted his red beans and rice during a block gathering, and had said, with the directness of a man who had grown up in New Orleans and therefore had opinions about red beans, "Boy, who taught you this?" Marcus had said, "My grandmother." Celestin had said, "She taught you right." There was a restaurant on the edge of the neighborhood, not a famous one, not a tourist one, a neighborhood restaurant, the kind that New Orleans still has in its older neighborhoods, the kind where the dining room has 12 tables, and the menu has been essentially the same for 20 years, and the people who eat there have been eating there for 20 years, and the food deserves that loyalty because it has earned it. It was called Maison Fontenot. Marcus had been eating there his whole life. His grandmother had taken him there on special occasions. His mother took him there for his birthday. He had studied its menu the way other children studied baseball cards. He had tried to reverse engineer its dishes at home, writing the attempts in his notebook with a column for what he thought they were doing and a column for whether his version matched. The head chef at Maison Fontenot was a man named Raymond Calvert. He had taken over the kitchen 7 years earlier, hired by the Fontenot family, who owned the restaurant after the previous chef of 20 years had retired. He was technically proficient. The food had not declined under his tenure, but something in it had also not advanced, a fact that longtime regulars mentioned in the particular oblique ways of people who are loyal to a place but honest with themselves. The restaurant offered, twice a year, what it called a kitchen observation program for students from the neighborhood. It was a community relations initiative, really, a gesture toward the neighborhood, which had been coming to this restaurant for generations. Students could apply, a few would be selected, and they would spend a Saturday afternoon in the kitchen watching service. Not cooking. Watching. Marcus had applied every cycle since he was 10. The first 2 times he had not been selected. The third time that fall, he had been. He arrived on a Saturday in November, wearing a clean shirt and carrying his notebook. He had read about kitchen etiquette. He stood where he was told to stand. He watched. He wrote in his notebook continuously, the small, neat handwriting that filled his pages, observations about technique and sequence, and the way the kitchen's rhythm organized itself around the pass. He stood there for 90 minutes, doing exactly what he had been told to do, and then the sauce on a pan at the station nearest him began to do what he could see it was doing, which was separate, which was break, because the burner had been left too high when the line cook stepped away for 40 seconds to deal with something at the adjacent station. Marcus looked at the pan. He looked at the line cook, who was not looking at it. He looked at the pan again. He stepped forward and turned the burner down a quarter turn, and picked up the tasting spoon that was sitting on the station spoon rest and stirred the sauce twice in a circular motion with the spoon at an angle, and the sauce, which had been at the edge of breaking, came back together. He could see it come back together. He tasted the spoon to confirm the texture had held. That was when Calvert saw him, and that was where we came in. The spoon taken out of his hand, the words in the air, the frozen kitchen. The 2 seconds Calvert looked at the pan, the boy walking out. Marcus walked through the back hallway of the restaurant, through the delivery entrance, out onto the side street. He stood in the November air and looked at his notebook in his hands and thought about what had just happened with the systematic calm of someone who is very upset, and has learned to process upset through thinking rather than through feeling, because feeling, in his experience, didn't produce the information that thinking did. The sauce had been breaking. He had fixed it. He had been thrown out anyway. He wrote in the notebook, pan sauce, rescued, butter emulsion, breaking under high heat, reduced temp and circular. Motion to reintroduce. Worked. Then on the next line, thrown out by Calvert for interfering. He underlined the word interfering. He thought about his grandmother's roux and the way she listened to it instead of watching it. He thought about what she had said to him once when he was 10 years old and had told her that a teacher at schools had said that cooking wasn't a real career for a boy from his neighborhood. His grandmother had been trimming okra at the time. She had not looked up from the okra. She had said, "Some people's kitchen is too small for the food you're going to make. You don't live in their kitchen. You build yours." He went home. He cooked dinner that night, a chicken fricassee with a sauce that his mother said was the best thing he had made so far, and she was a woman who paid close attention to such rankings. He did not stop. He had not planned to stop. Here is what he did not know about the notebook. 3 weeks after the kitchen incident, Marcus went to the public library. He went to the public library the way he always went, which was directly to the culinary section, where he had by now read every book on the shelf at least once, and several of them multiple times, and where he had, on previous visits, left small sticky notes on certain pages with observations or questions in his handwriting. The librarian, a woman named Ms. Evelyn Broussard, who had been at that branch for 18 years, and who had been watching Marcus come through those doors since he was 8 years old, and who had, over those 4 years, quietly made sure that new culinary acquisitions arrived at this branch rather than others because she knew he would use them. Ms. Broussard had a book on hold for him, a new acquisition, a collection of essays by working chefs about technique and philosophy and the relationship between the two. One of the essays was by a chef Marcus had been following since he was 9 years old on a television show that his grandmother had watched on Saturday afternoons when her programs were done. The chef's name was in the byline of the essay. Marcus read the essay standing in the aisle because he could not make himself wait until he sat down. At the back of the book there was a list of contributors with brief biographies. He read the biography 3 times. It mentioned a foundation. The foundation ran a youth culinary program. The foundation had an address and a submission process for applications, and, at the bottom of the page, an email address. Marcus went home. He wrote a letter. Not an email. A letter in his careful block handwriting on 2 sheets of lined paper, explaining who he was, and what he had been doing since he was 8 years old, and what he wanted to learn, and what he already knew. He enclosed 12 pages of his notebook, the most recent 12 pages, the ones that were most dense with technique and observation. Photocopied at the library for 15 cents a page. His mother had asked him what he was mailing. He had told her. She had said, "You think they'll write back?" He had said, "I don't know." She had looked at him for a moment and said, "Okay, send it." He sent it. He waited. He cooked. He waited. 3 weeks later, there was a response. Not a letter. A phone call to his mother's cell phone, which he had included as a contact because he was 12 and did not have his own phone. The call came on a Tuesday evening. Denise answered it. She handed the phone to Marcus with an expression he had not seen on her face before, which was the expression of a woman who has been surprised by something and is not yet sure how large it is. The voice on the phone was brisk and warm and British. It said, "Is this Marcus Turode?" He said yes. It said, "I've read your letter and I've looked at your pages. Tell me about the sauce you rescued at Maison Fontenot." Marcus told him. There was a pause. The voice said, "How did you know it was breaking before it broke?" Marcus said, "The sound changed. When the emulsion starts to go, the sound in the pan shifts. It gets a little lighter, like something leaving." Another pause. The voice said, "How long have you been doing this?" Marcus said, "Since I was 8. The voice said, "I'd like to meet you, and I'd like to speak with your mother." The voice on the phone was Gordon Ramsay. Now, let me be precise about what happened next, because it is easy for a story like this to become something neat and simple, and this is not that. Gordon Ramsay was not calling to hand Marcus a future wrapped in ribbon. He was calling because he had read 12 pages of a 12-year-old's notebook and recognized in it something that he had spent 30 years learning to recognize, which was the specific presence of genuine culinary intelligence. Not talent in the loose sense that word gets used, but actual structural understanding of how food works and why it works and what it is doing when it does what it does. He was calling because his foundation ran a program, and the program needed people like Marcus, and he had learned over years of running it that people like Marcus did not come from where the culinary world traditionally expected them to come from, and that this was not a problem with the people, it was a problem with the culinary world's field of vision. He spoke with Denise for 20 minutes. He was direct and specific and did not oversell. He described the program. He described what it offered and what it asked. He described what he had seen in the notebook pages and why he thought Marcus belonged in the program, and what the program could give Marcus that 12 pages suggested he was ready for. Denise was a woman who had spent her career in emergency rooms, which is an environment that teaches you to evaluate very quickly whether someone is telling you the truth about a situation. She asked 5 questions. She got 5 straight answers. She said she would call back in 2 days. She called Marcus's grandmother. Madeleine Turot listened to the whole thing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The boy has been writing in those notebooks since I gave him the first one. I knew then." Denise said, "You knew what?" Madeleine said, "That it was going to go somewhere we couldn't follow. You raise them, and they go where they go. The job is not to hold them. The job is to make sure they can fly." Denise called back in 2 days. She said yes. The program was residential, 2 weeks in the summer, at a facility in London. Ramsay's foundation covered travel, accommodation, and all program costs. There were 8 participants. They came from 6 countries. They ranged in age from 11 to 16. They were, each of them, carrying a notebook of one kind or another, a different metaphor in each case, but the same essential thing, which was a record of a mind that had been paying attention to food with a seriousness that no one had told it to. Marcus arrived in London with his notebook and his grandmother's instructions, which were 3. Pay attention, ask questions, and eat everything. He followed all 3. The program was 2 weeks of the most intense, illuminating, disorienting, and foundational experience of his life to that point. He learned techniques he had been approximating by instinct and could now name. He learned why the things he had been doing worked, in the chemical and physical terms that gave him a grammar for what had previously been a language he spoke without being able to read. He cooked with 7 other people his age who were as serious about this as he was, which was something he had never experienced. The specific relief of a room where your intensity is not unusual but is simply the baseline. And he cooked with Gordon Ramsay. Not in the abstract, literally. On the 3rd day of the program, Ramsay spent 4 hours in the kitchen with the 8 participants, rotating through each station, watching them work, asking questions, adjusting, teaching. He came to Marcus's station and watched him work for 10 minutes without saying anything. Then he said, "Where did you learn to listen to the pan?" Marcus said, "My grandmother." Ramsay said, "Bring her next time." He was not entirely joking. On the last day of the program, Ramsay gathered the 8 participants and spoke for about 20 minutes about what he had seen over the 2 weeks and what he thought about each of them. When he came to Marcus, he said something that the 7 other participants heard, that the program staff heard, that the 2 foundation board members who were visiting that day heard. He said, "This young man came here with something that programs don't give you, and money doesn't give you, and years don't always give you. He came here understanding that cooking is listening, that the food is always telling you something. His job, and our job in supporting him, is to make sure he gets the training to hear it more and more clearly." He paused. "He's a prodigy. I don't use that word carefully. I use it exactly." Marcus was sitting at a prep station when Ramsay said this. He did not react visibly. He thought about his grandmother's kitchen. He thought about a step stool made from 2 pieces of lumber and carpet. He thought about a notebook whose first entries were written in a handwriting that was still learning itself. He wrote it down that night, what Ramsay had said, word for word, as best he could remember it, on a new page. Now let me tell you what happened at Maison Fontenot. The news moved the way. News moves in a neighborhood where people know each other, which is quickly, and through multiple channels simultaneously. By the time Marcus came home from London, people on St. Bernard Avenue knew the broad shape of the story. Celestin the barber knew. The women at his grandmother's church knew. The family 2 doors down, who had been eating Madeleine's cooking for 30 years, knew. And someone who worked the lunch service at Maison Fontenot knew, and that person told someone else. And within 10 days of Marcus's return, the Fontenot family, the family that owned the restaurant, not Chef Calvert, the family, had heard a version of the story that was accurate in all its essential details. The Fontenot family had owned that restaurant for 3 generations. It was not an abstraction to them. It was their name on a sign in a neighborhood that had watched them for 3 generations, which meant they understood that the restaurant's relationship to its community was not a marketing strategy but a substance, a thing with weight that had to be maintained through actual behavior over actual time. They called a meeting. Calvert came to the meeting expecting to be backed up, the way people who have not yet understood the situation expect to be backed up. He sat across from Marguerite Fontenot, the family's current matriarch, 73 years old, who had been eating her own restaurant's food for 50 years, and who had noticed in the last 3 or 4 years a certain flatness in it that she had not said enough about, and now wished she had, and he described the incident in the kitchen as a matter of protocol and kitchen safety, and the importance of maintaining professional standards. Marguerite Fontenot listened to all of it. Then she said, "Raymond, the boy was right about the sauce." Calvert said, "That's not he was 12 years old. He had been standing quietly in the corner for 90 minutes doing exactly what we invited him there to do, and when he saw a problem he fixed it, and then you threw him out." She looked at him. "And now Gordon Ramsay has called this child a prodigy in front of a room of people, and the whole neighborhood knows about it. I want you to think about what story you are in." Calvert was quiet. The Fontenot family did not renew his contract, which came up for review 2 months later. The parting was handled professionally, without drama, in the manner of people who understand that how a thing ends is part of what the thing was. They called Marcus's mother. They offered Marcus a formal apprenticeship at Maison Fontenot, structured around his school schedule, with a mentorship agreement that brought in 2 Creole and Cajun culinary specialists from outside the restaurant to work with him specifically. They offered it in writing, with terms, because Marguerite Fontenot was a woman who understood that you didn't gesture at things you were serious about, you put them on paper. Denise read the offer and then called Ramsay's foundation to ask whether they had thoughts. The foundation's program director said it was a solid opportunity and that Marcus should take it if he wanted it. Marcus wanted it. He went back into that kitchen. Different now. His station, his terms. The same stainless steel prep counter where a spoon had been taken out of his hand 4 months earlier. He stood at it on his first Saturday, and he put his notebook on the corner of the station, which was where he always put it, and the sous chef who had been frozen near the pass on the day of the incident, a woman named Celine, who had been cooking in New Orleans restaurants for 12 years, came over and looked at the notebook and said, "Can I see?" He slid it toward her. She read for a while. She turned pages. She looked up and said, "You wrote all this yourself?" He said, "Yes." She handed it back. She said, "There's something in here I want to try, if you don't mind." He said he didn't mind. That was the beginning of a collaboration that neither of them had expected, and both of them needed. Celine knew things that Marcus's notebooks had been reaching toward. The technical vocabulary, the historical context, the accumulated knowledge of 12 years in professional kitchens. Marcus had things that Celine had never encountered in quite this form: the listening, the intuition, the structural understanding of what food was doing underneath what it appeared to be doing. They taught each other without announcing that they were teaching each other. The way the best culinary education has always worked. Madeleine Thureau came to the restaurant one Saturday in early spring, not as a customer. Marguerite Fontenot had invited her personally, through Denise, with a phone call that Marguerite had made herself. The two women had known each other for 40 years. They sat in the dining room after service with coffee and talked for 2 hours. At one point, Marguerite said, "You knew he was something." Madeleine said, "I knew he was listening. In my experience, that's the beginning of everything." Marcus cooked for them that evening 2 dishes. His grandmother's gumbo, rendered in his own hand with the accumulated understanding of 4 years of notebooks and 2 weeks in London, and every Saturday since. And a second dish, his own, original, not a version of anything else. A thing he had been working out for 3 months. A crab and sweet potato composition with a sauce that borrowed from the Creole tradition and went somewhere the tradition hadn't been yet. Madeleine ate it and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You went somewhere I couldn't follow." She said it the way she had told Denise she would say it, not with loss, with completion, with the specific satisfaction of a woman who had handed a notebook to an 8-year-old and told him to write things down and was now watching what had been written find its way onto a plate that tasted like the future being made from the past. Marcus kept the notebook. He would keep notebooks his entire life, which any serious reader of culinary history would recognize as the correct approach, because the notebooks of the people who changed cooking are always where you find the real thing, the thinking, the failing, the noticing, the endless patient accumulation of attention that eventually produces something the world didn't have before. Ramsay's foundation brought Marcus back the following summer as a returning participant, and the summer after that as something new, which was a junior instructor. The youngest the program had ever had, for the week on sauce and emulsion. He was 15. He stood at the front of a kitchen and taught 11 and 12 and 13-year-olds how to listen to a pan. He told them what his grandmother had told him. He said, "The sound tells you more than the color, if you know how to listen." He told them something else. He said, "Someone is going to take a spoon out of your hand at some point. They are going to tell you that you don't belong in the room. They are going to be wrong, and you are going to know they are wrong. And the knowing is the thing you hold on to. You hold it, and you go home, and you cook, and you write it down, and you keep going." He paused. "You keep going." The kitchen was very quiet. He went back to his station. He picked up a spoon. He kept going. If this story found you today, if it settled something in you that needed settling, or lit something that had been going dim, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone in your life who is being told the wrong things about themselves. And subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories that matter. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Has anyone ever taken something out of your hands and told you it wasn't yours to hold? What did you do? Here's what really gets me. And I've been sitting with this one since I started writing it. It's not the spoon, and it's not Gordon Ramsay, as much as I love the image of that phone call landing in a Treme apartment on a Tuesday evening. What really gets me is the notebook, the first notebook. Madeleine Thoreau handing a notebook to an 8-year-old in an 11-square-foot kitchen and saying, "You're going to want to remember things, write them down, and then going back to the stove without ceremony, without performance, without making it a lesson." Just a woman who could see what was in front of her, giving it the right tool and getting out of its way. That notebook is the whole story. Everything that follows is in that notebook. The rescue of the pan sauce, the 12 photocopied pages, the phone call, London, the apprenticeship, the 15-year-old teaching other children to listen. All of it lives in that first entry, in handwriting that was still learning itself, describing what Madeleine's hands did one Sunday afternoon over a roux that you had to listen to, not watch. That is what it looks like to see a child clearly, not to project onto them what you want them to be, not to protect them from what you're afraid of, but to see what is actually there and hand it the right notebook and say, write things down. Trust that what's in them will find its way onto the page if you give them somewhere to put it. And here is the part that stays with me most. Madeleine said, at the end of it, "You went somewhere I couldn't follow." And she said it with satisfaction, with completion, because that was always the point. You don't raise children or teach students or hand notebooks to 8-year-olds so that they will stay inside the radius of what you already know. You do it so they can go further. You do it so they can take what you gave them and go somewhere you couldn't see, from where you were standing. That is the inheritance. That is what keeps moving forward through the generations, through the notebooks, through the hands that hand, other hands the right tools at the right moment, and then step back. What was your notebook? Who handed it to you? Who looked at you clearly, without agenda, without ceiling, and said, "Here, this is yours. Write things down. Tell me who they were. Tell me in the comments. I want to know every one of their names."